Hey Skeeters, today we're going to talk about Standard 2C, so let's take a look. Standard 2C states, relate the figurative language of a literary work to its historical and cultural setting. So, figurative language, let's talk about that for a second. Two pieces of figurative language we know pretty well are simile and metaphor. So those are two examples of figurative language. Basically, what figurative language is going to do in any shape or form that it's in. It doesn't have to just be the simile and metaphor. But figurative language is going to give you a picture and kind of fluff up the story. It's going to give the reader an opportunity to visualize what it is the author is telling, what story they're telling. Okay? And that could be through the simile metaphor, like I said, comparing things. It could be through what's called a hyperbole, or exaggerating something, like, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. You can't really eat a whole horse, so nor should you eat a horse. But that's what figurative language is going to do. Okay, so in that regard, similes and metaphors, okay, if we're comparing things, you're going to relate how those things connect the book to the historical or cultural time period that it's being written about or in. Okay, so for example, if we look at To Kill a Mockingbird, okay, this was a book I talked about in the last video. The author is Harper Lee. It was published in 1960. And actually, the whole premise of the story is kind of sort of based on something that she observed in her community as a young girl. And it is actually an event that took place in her community, but it's not exactly like it. She kind of used the figurative language that she was familiar with or was comfortable with writing in to retell her story in a little bit of a different way. Okay, so being able to identify and relate figurative language to the culture or the historical setting. So again, her book was published in the 60s, but at the time when she wrote it, at the time that she wrote it about, in the 30s, there was a different kind of culture, if that makes sense. They were kind of similar in time period, but there were things like the language was different, things that they said were different, extremes in the story. So it's about an African American man who was accused of a crime that he did not commit. And so the whole book is about the trial process and going through court and how people treated him and how the relationships he had with people in his community and things like that. And so if you think about, we are somewhat educated on the 60s, okay, and what things were going on in the 60s. And so if you think about the cultural time period then and things going on historically in that time period, then you can kind of make that connection to the story she's telling through her book. Okay, so there are test questions that you will be asked that kind of relate to this standard. And again, it's connecting the figurative language from the story to the time period it's written in. Okay, so I know that's kind of confusing, but we'll get through it. So, for example, there's a star passage called American Apple, and this is one of the questions from that passage. And it goes like this. The author uses a simile to describe the apples in paragraph 2 to convey what? So we're looking at how the simile in paragraph 2, what that shows or conveys. It's another word for shows. Okay, so it says, my grandfather had a collection of traditional Chinese scholar arts, inkwells from dynasties past, fans hand-painted by famous artists, Zaitan wooden brush holders, chicken blood stamped stones, rare books of calligraphy. For 2 months before I was taken away from our Shanghai home, every night before we went to sleep, my grandfather would pull these objects carefully out of their wrapping papers and examine them. He would touch them delicately as though they were dear old friends. Then he would select one object to keep on the nightstand next to his bed. The following day, a mask of sorrow covering his usually serene face, he would go out into the streets of Shanghai and sell it for a pittance. Okay, so we're looking for the simile, and they are right. It is right here. He would touch them delicately as though they were dear old friends. So again, a simile is comparing two things with the word like or as. So them is apples, as referred to here in this question. So we're trying to figure out what that shows and how that can connect to the historical aspect or the cultural aspect of this text. And so based on what we read, the little section here, we can automatically assume without having read the whole passage that it has to do with a Chinese culture. It's listed right here, and then he talks about being in Shanghai. So automatically that can kind of give us some clues into how to answer this question. So let's look at the answer choices. Okay, so the author uses this simile to show what? Their mythical appeal. So the word mythic, if we look it up, is, thought it would pop up. That's okay if it doesn't. But the definition of mythic is like an exaggerated, what's the word? An exaggerated example. Okay, so it's like this. Hold on, let me make sure I'm telling you correctly. There we go. Exaggerated or idealized. So yeah, that was the other word, idealized. So you're kind of putting this thing on a pedestal of like honoring it or enjoying it or having it, idealizing it. Okay, so and then he talks about how he's sad because he's gonna have to go sell it for a small price. So I think we can keep this answer choice. Let's look at all the other ones just to make sure. But then we've got G, the advertising techniques used in foreign magazines. So we don't read anything about foreign magazines or anything. So G is not the right answer. So we'll just mark that one out. Their universal symbolism. So you can kind of assume that there's some type of symbolism with these apples because of how much these pieces are looked after by this man, the grandfather. But it doesn't really talk about them being universal. We're only in Shanghai here, so we have to be careful about all the words in our answer choices. So H is not the right answer. J, the contrast between Chinese and foreign supermarkets. There is no mention of foreign supermarkets, so J is not it. And so the correct answer is F. So the key here is just making sure you read all the words and use all the words in the answer choices, not just paying attention to one or two. And also just process of elimination, just going through each answer choice and double checking with the text and making sure that it is proven or not proven. So hopefully this helps. We empower, we impact, we love. We are Skeeter Nation.